Here's what productivity experts miss about this whole corporate world. It's built around teamwork, not solo work. Many productivity systems prioritize individual optimization of time. Find out what works best for you and do that. But corporate life equals collaboration, communication, and a lot of shared responsibility. Hi, I'm Chris LeBrun, your host of the Wholistic Productivity Podcast. As someone who's never been afraid of dreaming big and going for it all, I often find myself with a lot on my plate. I'm a husband and father, a nonprofit fundraiser, and an entrepreneur. What I've realized is my view of productivity was pretty toxic. After decades of believing that in order to do more, you had to work harder, I began to see productivity as this beautiful thing. Holistic productivity is the idea that you can accomplish your professional, personal, and purpose-driven goals in a healthy way, and doing so will make you happier and more fulfilled. Join me each week as we break down myths about productivity, share practical tips for maximizing your time, energy, and focus, and hear from others about their productivity journey. This is the Holistic Productivity Podcast. Welcome to episode number 38 of the Holistic Productivity Podcast. My name is Chris LeBrun. I'm your host. I'm a productivity coach, and I am grateful that you are here for this episode. We have a great episode for you today. It's a continuation of what we started last week, our two-part series here, but don't worry, if you didn't listen, you can get the gist of it. We'll get to that in a minute. But, I say this every episode. The reason that I do this show is to help you dream big, plan smart, and live fully. I don't take that lightly. I know how important my goals are to me, my professional goals, my personal goals, and my purpose-driven goals. And I can only imagine that your goals are just as important to you. That's why I keep doing this podcast week after week, because I want you to achieve your goals. I want you to have that feeling of relief and excitement and pride when you achieve your dreams. And here's the thing. When that happens for you, you're helping me achieve one of my purpose goals, which is helping you reach your goals. That's why I'm in this. So thank you for being here, and let's do this together. Let's both achieve our goals at the same time. It's fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. Last week, we started this series about the relationship between productivity and corporate America. And in the first episode, we looked at the assumptions that corporate America sometimes makes about productivity. Well, today we are turning the mirror around, because if I'm being honest, the productivity world has its own blind spots as well. And I don't want to make it seem like, everything is hunky-dory over here and it's just all bad and doom and gloom in corporate world. A lot of the tips and tricks and well-meaning advice floating around on the internet is designed primarily for entrepreneurs, people who control their schedule, people who control their workload and their environment and their priorities. But millions of people work inside corporate systems where they don't have full autonomy. Your calendar is shared, your meetings are mandatory, and oftentimes your priorities are set by somebody else, right? When productivity advice ignores that reality, it can make people feel like they're failing when they're actually doing their best inside some very real constraints. So today, we're going to explore what productivity experts often get wrong about productivity in corporate America and what it looks like to thrive productively within those structures. Look, this doesn't mean that you have to blow up your calendar or quit your job to chase a dream, but we are going to focus on creating small, intentional shifts within the world that you are actually working in. And again, like I said, if you haven't listened to part one, I'll put a link in the show notes. You can go back and listen to that. But this episode should stand on its own if you haven't listened to that one. You won't be lost. So let's get into it here. What is the fundamental disconnect that productivity experts assume when when we are giving you advice and how to be more productive? Well, a lot of that boils down to autonomy. Corporate employees rarely choose their work. There's a job description for every single job in corporate America, even the CEO. There are KPI and corporate goals that govern our priorities, and these flow downstream. And the quote unquote lower you are on the org chart, the less autonomy you probably have, right? That includes your schedule. If you work in corporate, you have required meetings and events that are scheduled for you. And it's very difficult to decline those assignments or those meetings. And you also rarely control your communication norms. Now, look, we're going to dive into all of these, expand on them, but that's kind of the overview of what we are looking at here and what the reality is. A lot of this advice, like I said, is built around or aimed at entrepreneurs, people who have control. And that just doesn't translate well. So we're going to talk about some of those things that you will often hear me and other productivity coaches talking about when it comes to best practices for productivity. One of the big ones that we talk about, I know I've talked about it, is designing your day or structuring your day around your energy. Put your high energy tasks at a time when you have a lot of energy. Well, this is beautiful in theory if you're an entrepreneur or if you work from home. But it's almost impossible if your boss schedules a meeting at 9 a.m. every day, right? Corporate life is structured around team rhythms, not personal rhythms. It's great if your energy is focused between the hours of 9 to 5, but not so much if you thrive at other hours of the day. And so this idea of, work when you have your energy just doesn't work in a corporate space. The other one that doesn't work is the ability to say no to certain projects, certain tasks, or certain things. One of the things productivity coaches love to talk about is protecting yourself from being overworked and from getting bad clients or projects. It's great advice, but in the corporate world, there are certain realities, right? You have different hierarchies, whether it's on the org chart or politically, how people are structured and seen politically within the company and the organization. Everybody's got performance reviews and they're required or expected to do certain things. And you have a team that's depending on you. Saying no is not always allowed. And if it is, it's probably not good for career advancement. So what we need to do is look at how to set boundaries ethically within those constraints. Now, one of the tips that I've used in the corporate world with some success, with some good success, is when a request comes in last minute or something that is not really aligned with our overall strategy, I ask my boss or whoever's giving me the new task something like this: which one of the following priorities that are already on my plate would you like me to set aside to focus on this new project? That's one way that you can do it. You may also want to ask, which one of our goals and objectives does this new project align with? The point here is not to be, assertive and say, I'm not doing this. The point is to ask for clarity around what's going to give. It lets them know that there will be a productivity cost somewhere else if you are going to focus on this task or if your team is going to focus on this. Then you can start having a conversation about other ways to accomplish either the new thing or the existing thing. Maybe that's contractors or other team members. Or you really go back to square zero and say, do we really need to do this? at all? Or is there something else that we can ignore and push it to later? But that gives you the space to have those types of conversations. Now, a lot of this depends on how much autonomy you have to accomplish the job that you were hired to do. If you are in a situation where you are being micromanaged, saying no will be harder than if you have some level of control over how you structure your day. If the boss is really only concerned about the outcome, you may have some more ability to say no or yes to tasks. Another thing, somewhat related to this idea of saying no, is eliminating or outsourcing low impact tasks or tasks that you just don't enjoy. Now, this is a common thing for productivity gurus and experts to talk about, from people like Tim Ferriss or Dan Martell and others. Look, the common adage is that there's a large portion of the work that you do that you really shouldn't be spending time on. Your time is better spent bringing more value and ROI to the organization by focusing on higher impact tasks. But since these low impact tasks need to get done, you should just designate them or delegate them or outsource them. Now, a lot of times this involves a virtual assistant. But if you work in a corporate environment, you can't just hire a virtual assistant for yourself, right? That seems ludicrous. They're not just going to give you money to hire someone to do the work that they are already paying you to do. And if you decide that you want to, for some reason, pay for this out of your own pocket, you may still run into corporate rules or systems that prohibit this type of thing from happening, whether it's privacy or ownership of work or even just access to network files, the security limitations. Delegation is often limited by reporting lines and internal processes. So I can't just take it to somebody else on the team and say, hey, I don't want to do this. You do that. And really, what would that look like to tell them, you're not as important as I am. I bring more value to the team. No, you don't want to do that. That's politically not good. There's perception matters there, right? So that's not something that you want to do either. Yes, your company may ultimately benefit from you outsourcing or delegating these low impact tasks, but this will probably take a lot of conversation to get leadership on board, and it may take some time for them to actually see the results as well. So even if they do let you do it, you're probably going to be on a very short leash. Now, another version of this same idea or mentality is to really lean into that 80-20 rule, also known as Pareto's principle. And that idea is just get rid of 80% of your customers that only bring you 20% of your revenue so that you can focus on more customers that are similar to the 20% of your current customers that are bringing you 80% of your business. Now, this is great for entrepreneurs, right? They want to get rid of those 80% of customers that are taking tons of time and not really bringing a whole lot of revenue to the table. Now, if you can have this type of conversation with your leadership team and look at this as a strategy for the organization overall, that's great. And I would highly recommend having that kind of conversation. But can you imagine the fallout if you just unilaterally decided that you were going to ditch 80% of the company's customers? They're going to unilaterally ditch you, and you're going to have all the time in the world you want to do whatever it is you want because you ain't going to be working there no more, right? Like that just isn't possible. Another thing that we talk about all the time in the productivity space is blocking time for deep work. Now, this is something that you might have some opportunity to do in the corporate world, but blocked time doesn't work well when there are a slew of mandatory meetings and when you have to coordinate schedules with other team members and coworkers. Many employees have shared calendars and their boss can override things that are already scheduled on their calendar. Look, I've had times where the only time my boss or a team member could meet was in the middle of time that I wanted to use for deep work. And so I have to then decide, who am I going to disappoint in this situation? And sometimes, honestly, it's just better to disappoint myself and say, well, look, I'll try to figure out how to get deep work in somewhere else. And let's face it, interruption culture already makes deep work a system level issue. It's a problem. Not everyone is lucky enough to have an office with a closed door. I think I've told the story of my coworker, Ashley. We worked together about 10 years ago, and she was in a cubicle. Ashley was one of the writers at our nonprofit, and regularly she would put up a sign telling people, stay away. I'm writing. I'm trying to be in the zone. And I sat right across from Ashley, and I would watch. Inevitably, as she hung that sign on her cubicle, people would still come in and ask her questions throughout the day, interrupting her writing, interrupting the deep work that she was trying to do. Now, many people didn't see it, but I've also seen people who just thought that they were more important. I've actually seen that where people go and open up a closed door and barge into a meeting or to an office because they just need to talk to you in that moment. I mean, that is a whole nother level. It's one thing if you don't see the sign, but when you see that door closed and you think that your issue is more important, yeah, okay, that's a whole nother conversation that we won't go down. Here's another one that you may have heard. If a job drains you, just quit. Now, I understand if you are in a toxic environment, your mental health is at risk. And that's why, people, especially like myself, talk about your mental health and how important that is. There are times that you may need to look for new opportunities that protect you and shield you from these types of situations. But not everybody can just walk away and replace the income that they are earning or risk instability for their family. Career path constraints and financial realities really do matter. And so, yes, there are times when walking away from a stressful situation is the best thing that you can do, but you shouldn't just take that at face value. You have to really make sure that that is right for you and your situation. Another issue that we run into is uh, recommending entrepreneur tools for employee problems. Experts love to suggest software or workflows that sometimes just frankly don't work in the corporate ecosystem. Employees are often mandated which systems we are going to use, which software we're going to use, whether it's SharePoint or Teams or Salesforce or Zoom or any number of project management software. There's also security issues that come into play. A few years ago, I wanted to test out a piece of software, and to get the full experience with it, I had to connect it to our enterprise Microsoft system. Well, look, IT did not like that idea. They hadn't vetted the software, and that meant they weren't going to give me permission to use something that was untested, that they didn't know about the security vulnerabilities. And I don't blame them. So that didn't really get to work out. Here's another one of my favorite suggestions that productivity coaches love to give. It just cracks me up, and that is checking email once a week. Look, email and other notifications from Teams, from instant messenger or chat, they can kill your momentum and flow. And that's why a lot of productivity experts talk about limiting email use. Tim Ferriss was the first person I heard talking about a massive reduction in email usage. I think Ferriss checks his email now like once a month. Some of the other coaches are talking about once a week or maybe only once a day or twice a day. Look, like all of these things, this idea has a lot of merit. Email interrupts the flow and gets us bogged down in all these rabbit trails that usually have minimal impact. answering emails all day is probably not the best use of your time. But corporate culture is built around email and increasingly around instant messaging. I can only imagine what would happen if I set up an autoresponder that says, "Thanks for your email, but now I check my email once a week and I'll respond on Friday." you know, that is not going to go over well with my boss, with my coworkers, or with the donors that I serve. Honestly, that is my big concern at my nonprofit work. If you want to reduce your dependency on email, make sure you ease into it and have some conversations and education opportunities with your boss, with your team members before you do that. Try to find something that is going to work out in your situation. Here's what productivity experts miss about this whole corporate world. It's built around teamwork, not solo work. Many productivity systems prioritize individual optimization of time. Find out what works best for you and do that. But corporate life equals collaboration, communication, and a lot of shared responsibility. It also includes meetings. As bad of a habit as that is, as bad culture as that may be, it's part of our cultural infrastructure. Most organizations wouldn't know how to function without meetings. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or that we should excuse that. But for many, they serve a lot of different functions. It's part emotional, it's part political, it's part alignment and communication. Many times meetings reflect trust and ownership and ultimately come down to help shape organizational clarity. These things have value in the corporate world because of the size of most corporate organizations. Small teams, entrepreneurs and solopreneurs don't need as many meetings because the nature of their work is often more aligned. And there's not as many moving parts, so it's not as necessary. Performance is also a social thing. It's not just personal. Again, there's teamwork that goes into these. It's not just one person trying to accomplish everything. And promotions, raises, and projects hinge on relationships. Unfortunately, productivity advice that ignores that misses the real game. So, what actually works for corporate professionals? I want to take some time here to just look at some of the ways that we can actually take advice from productivity experts and use it in the corporate environment. What corporate employees need to do is, number one, understand the philosophy behind the productivity advice that they're getting or reading. You need to know why checking email 12 times an hour is killing your productivity. So that's number one. Number two, develop some alternatives or variations that will still meet the objectives of the productivity tip, but is doable within your corporate culture. And honestly, that's going to vary from one organization to the next. There's no one size that fits all, even in the corporate space. Number three, you need to open lines of communication with your boss and your team. Talk through the challenges with them without making accusations and present your suggestions. And look, there can be safe ways of doing this. You can say, "This may sound like a crazy idea that I read in a book, but what do you think about this? How would that work to bring something like this into our organization?" So you don't even have to put yourself on the hook for doing this or for suggesting this. But most employers are going to respect your desire to be more productive, and they're going to be much more willing to consider changes if you bring suggestions. They don't want you to bring problems without bringing a suggestion. Some of the things that you may want to focus on are micro boundaries instead of hard no's, negotiating meeting expectations. Figure out, are you actually required to be at all the meetings that happen, or can you get notes and follow up afterwards? You can clarify the priorities with your managers. We talked about that. And then optimizing energy that you have within the constraints of your workday. There's still going to be ebbs and flows within that 9 to 5 window, and knowing when that is can help you still structure your day around that. Now, I wouldn't try to accomplish all of these things at once. Go for some of the low-hanging fruit and start there. And make sure that you are using your influence to talk through some of these issues rather than your authority to promote some of these ideas, right? You may be the boss on your team, but that still doesn't mean that people under you are ready to change their entire way of working in the corporate life. So have those conversations, get their buy-in, and you may ultimately still decide that this is what we're going to do, but hopefully you've built up some trust with your team as you talk through some of the issues. There has to be a lot of education around what you're trying to accomplish and why. And that takes strategic over communication. Look, all of this comes down to political capital. And it's kind of a catch-22 because one of the best ways to influence people in the corporate world is if you are productive and you are a high achiever and people say, hey, look at this guy, look at this lady. They are bringing it. We should listen to them. But you need some of these strategies in place so that you can be more of a high achiever, so that you can gain that political capital necessary for getting these strategies approved. So it's kind of a catch-22 there. Look, as we wrap this up, it's important to remember productivity isn't one size fits all, and it definitely isn't one industry fits all. What works beautifully for a solopreneur may fall apart in a corporate team environment. And that's okay. You're not a failure and you're not doing it wrong just because it doesn't work in your environment. The real skill is learning how to adapt productivity principles with wisdom, nuance, and respect for everybody else that you are working with and the environment in which you're working in. So here's your challenge for this week. Pick one piece of productivity advice that you've heard me talk about, or you've heard somebody else talk about, something that doesn't really quite fit into your corporate reality, and start thinking about how you would rewrite it for your environment. You might be surprised how powerful the corporate friendly version becomes once you shape that to your particular working situation. And of course, if you missed the first episode, go back and listen to that, because that is going to help you understand what the corporate world gets wrong about productivity. So that's it for the show today. Thank you for being here. I hope this was helpful for you as you try to take all this stuff that you're reading or hearing and shape it into something that you can actually use in your environment. Check out the show notes at holisticproductivity.com/38. And if you are listening to this on your favorite podcast platform, go ahead and subscribe, follow, like, rate the show if you'd like. All of these things help us get the show into the hands of more people, into the ears, honestly, of more people, or eyes if you're watching it on YouTube. But go ahead, subscribe. That way you will not miss the next episode when it comes out. Be sure to follow at Wholistic Productivity on all of the social media platforms. I provide productivity tips and motivation throughout the week. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, Threads, LinkedIn, YouTube, Substack, all of them. I think there's probably a couple of other ones, but that's all the important ones. And I also want to invite you to join the Holistic Productivity community on School. Look, I'm so excited about what is happening on School because it's not just me talking to you or talking at you. It's everybody coming together. It's a community of people who are like-minded, who are achieving goals, and they're trying to do that in better, more productive ways. So when you join the community on School, first of all, it's free. but there's a lot of great resources that you can learn from, and you can also learn from a lot of great people. So check that out. Link will be in the show notes, and you can find us on Skool. That's Skool. As always, thank you so much for listening in. I said it at the top of the show, but my goal is to help you dream big, plan smart, and live fully. And I hope that this episode has helped you do that. Take care. We'll see you next time.